The Nelson class was a class of 2 battleships of the British Royal Navy, built shortly after and under the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. They were the only British battleships built between the Revenge class and the King George V class, ordered in 1936. The ships were named after famous British admirals: George Brydges Rodney, 1st Baron Rodney of the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, and Horatio Nelson, 1st Viscount Nelson of the battles of the Nile and Trafalgar. To comply with the limitations of the Washington Treaty, these ships were of an unusual design with many novel features. They are often referred to as the first treaty battleships. The Nelsons were unique in British battleship construction, being the only ships to carry a main armament of 9 16-inch guns. The most unusual feature, however, and one that is immediately noticeable, is that these were all carried forward of the bridge. Commissioned in 1927–29, the Nelsons served extensively in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Indian Oceans during World War II. Rodney was made famous by her role in the sinking of the German battleship Bismarck in May 1941. At the climax of the battle, Rodney, in conjunction with King George V, closed on Bismarck to bombard her at short range. Rodney's main guns were credited with an estimated 100 to 130 hits, contributing greatly to her final destruction. Nelson and Rodney participated in the bombardment of targets in northern France during and after D-Day. In particular, during the Caen campaign, Nelson was credited with destroying a group of 5 Tiger tanks which ventured into a red zone of the coast deemed by the German command to be in range of Allied battleships. The 2 ships of the class survived the war, but were scrapped in 1948–49 along with all other British battleships except the King George V class battleships and Vanguard. History and design. The Battle of Jutland had shown the value of firepower and protection over speed and maneuverability. The next generation of British warships incorporated this lesson. After the First World War, the Admiralty drew up plans for massive, heavily armoured battlecruisers and battleships, far larger and stronger than all previous vessels. The G3 class battlecruisers would carry 16-inch guns, and the proposed N3 class battleships would carry 9 18-inch guns, and would be the most powerful vessels afloat. The Royal Navy was planning to hold its superiority in the burgeoning arms race, despite the large warships planned in Japan and the United States. Development was abruptly curtailed by the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, which brought the arms race to a halt. The 4 battlecruisers that had been ordered were cancelled. Some of the material acquired would later be used in Nelson and Rodney. The treaty limited all nations' battleships to 35,000 tons and 16-inch guns. The British had successfully ensured that the definition of maximum displacement, the standard displacement, excluded both fuel and boiler feed water. They had argued that having to protect the widespread British Empire meant the ships had to carry more of both and they should not be penalized, compared to nations such as Japan, France and Italy, that operated normally much closer to the home bases. As a result, water-filled internal anti-torpedo bulges could be incorporated, which did not contribute to the dry weights and therefore did not exceed the treaty displacement limits. The limits of the treaty inevitably led to compromises in the design of 2 new ships, and the resulting Nelson class sacrificed installed power in order that they be well armed and defended. They were often referred to as the cherry tree class because they had been cut down by Washington. The need to limit displacement resulted in a radical new warship design, drawn from the G3 and N3 designs of Eustace Dennis and Danecourt, Director of Naval Construction from 1912 to 1924. To reduce the weight of armor, the main gun turrets were all mounted forward to shorten the armored citadel. The G3 and N3 had 2 turrets forward of the bridge with the third between the bridge and the funnels aft superstructure. However, in the Nelsons, this was taken further and all 3 were in front of the bridge B, mount super firing over A, with X turret on the FOCSLE deck behind B, and therefore unable to fire directly forward or aft. X turret is sometimes referred to as C turret, and one alternative design, designated O3, had its super firing over both A and B turrets. The secondary guns were placed in totally enclosed director-controlled twin turrets at the upper deck level and were grouped aft. Another innovative element taken from the G3 and N3 design. The machinery was of necessity limited in weight, size and installed power, and there were only 2 shafts with quite large screws. All previous British battleships since HMS Dreadnought of 1906 had 4 screws, as did all British battleship classes after Nelson. In order that flue gases be kept clear of the superstructure, the boiler rooms were moved behind the engine rooms, exhausting into a single funnel. This orientation also reduced the overall length of the armored citadel. As a countermeasure to the limited power, the hull was of a very efficient hydrodynamic form, to attain the best possible speed. Armor weight was also reduced by using an internal, inclined armor belt sloped outward at 72 degrees vertically, 14 in thick over the main magazines and control positions to 13 in over the machinery and 6-inch gun magazines. The slope increased the relative thickness of the belt to a plunging projectile. Water-filled compartments, surrounded by air-filled ones, formed internal torpedo bulges which were fitted between the armor and the external hull of the ship, which was not armored. The outer hull plating was meant to initiate detonation of shells which would then explode outside the armor. This innovation dispensed with external torpedo bulges which would otherwise have reduced the speed of the ships due to drag. The armor scheme was of the all-or-nothing principle. Areas were either well protected from the front of A barbette rearwards to the after 6-inch turrets, or were not protected at all, disposing of the multiple intermediate thickness of armor seen in older designs. For the first time a British battleship had a single 6.25 in thick armored deck to protect against plunging shells and aircraft-launched bombs, with 4.25 in armor over the stern, both on top of the 0.5 in deck plating. The main turrets had 16 in non-cemented armor on the faces, 11 in on the sides, 7.25 in on the roof and 9 in on the rear, with 15 in around the barbettes. The secondary turrets, however, had only 1 in NC all round over 0.5 in structural steel plates. Superstructure. The large superstructure, which was octagonal in plan, was known to its crew as the octopoidal, and was sometimes referred to as Queen Anne's Mansions, due to its similarity to a 14-story brick residential development named Queen Anne's Mansions opposite London's St James's Park tube station. The superstructure provided spacious, weatherproof working spaces for the navigating officers and any flag officers embarked. This innovative bridge design was subsequently copied by the French in the Dunkirk-class battleships, as was the all-forward main armament orientation, features which were both repeated in the Richelieu-class designs, except for the emergency conning tower at its base, and the trunking for the main gun directors mounted on top. The superstructure was lightly armored against splinters only to save weight. Additional weight-saving design measures included the use of light materials such as aluminium for fittings, and fir instead of teak for deck planking, although subsequently antique decks were fitted in the late 1920s, following concerns that the ships could not fire a full broadside without causing structural damage to the decks. The Nelson class was a revolutionary but compromised design, and unsurprisingly there were shortcomings. The location of the superstructure towards the stern caused maneuverability problems in high winds, especially when steaming at low speeds, where the superstructure acted somewhat like a mizzen-sail permanently set, causing the ships to weather vane. But according to Captain Hugh Binney, who commanded Nelson in the late 20s, if this is kept in mind, no real difficulties should be encountered in any circumstances. This was potentially a problem in crowded harbors, and made the ships somewhat difficult to dock and embark, although this issue never led to a major incident. Binney also stated, in the early stages of the ship's first commission, there was a general misconception that the Nelson class were unhandy and difficult to maneuver. Both my predecessor and myself, however, very soon discovered that this opinion was entirely fallacious. In calm weather, the ship's maneuvering capabilities are in no way inferior, and in many ways superior to those of Queen Elizabeth the Revenge. Quote, "They could also be awkward to maneuver when moving astern. This was attributed to the ships having a single central rudder which was out of the propeller race of the twin screws. At sea, however, they were reported to handle well, with a comparatively small tactical diameter, particularly when turning into the wind." According to Lt. CMDR Godfrey Ran, who served in 1941–2 as the navigator for both the Nelson and subsequently the Rodney, he reported no difficulty in navigating either ship through the boom gates at Scapa Flow. The Nelson and the Rodney were the only battleships never to have bumped the boom gate vessel as they passed through Hoxha Sound. Armament. The main armament of 9 16-inch guns were mounted in triple turrets, the only RN battleships designed in this manner. The guns themselves deviated from standard British designs, where previous RN weapons fired heavy shells at a moderate velocity. The Nelson's weapons followed the German practice of a lighter shell at a high velocity. This change in Director of Naval Ordnance Policy was due to British testing of surrendered German equipment after World War I, although much later, subsequent testing proved contradictory. Two different rifling rates were tried, and for some time there was a mixture of barrel types in different turrets. Even sometimes within the same turret, the guns suffered considerable barrel wear and had a fairly large dispersion pattern, due mainly to the different riflings that each barrel had as they were refurbished over the lifespan. To compensate for barrel wear, muzzle velocities were reduced and a heavier shell was tried to offset this, but the cost of producing new shells, modifying shell handling and storage equipment came at a time when RN funding had been heavily reduced. Nevertheless, these weapons were not generally considered by the RN to be as successful as the previous BL 15-inch Mark I, although they were considered more successful than the BL 14-inch Mark VII fitted to the subsequent King George V class battleships. The need to reduce displacement led to the use of triple mount turrets, which had early problems with the ammunition handling and loading machinery. The heavier weight of the triple in comparison to a twin turret meant increased stresses on the roller bearings when training the turrets. This was solved by the incorporation of spring-loaded vertical as well as conventional horizontal roller bearings. The triple mount turret proved itself when, in October 1929, a turret crew with 2 years' experience loaded and fired 33 consecutive rounds without mishap. The incorporation of many safety features, achieved with lighter materials, meant that the complex and relatively fragile equipment had to be serviced regularly over the ship's lifetime. These ships were fitted with the HACSAA fire control system and the Admiralty Fire Control Table (MKI) for surface surface fire control of the main armament. The blast of the guns disrupted some officers on the bridge to such an extent that the guns of X turret were usually prohibited from firing abaft of the beam at high elevations of 40 degrees during peacetime practice firing. Fitting tempered glass in the bridge windows was tried, but gun blasts shattered some of them and filled the bridge with flying debris. A great deal of effort was expended in correcting this problem, and fitting of protective ledges below the bridge windows proved successful. Blast was also a problem elsewhere. D.K. Brown tells of a test firing that was suspended when DNC observer H.S. Pengelly, who was beneath the foredeck, reported a bright red flash after firing all guns in a turret. This was later discovered to be caused by concussion of the observer's eyeballs. In the final phase of the action against Bismarck, Rodney fired two 24.5-INCH torpedoes from her port side tube and claimed one hit. According to Ludovic Kennedy, if true, the only instance in history of one battleship torpedoing another. Earlier in this same action, the starboard side tube had its sluice door jammed as the result of a near miss from one of Bismarck's early salvos. On the 27th of September 1941, Nelson's port torpedo station almost proved to be a liability when an Italian air-launched 18-inch torpedo holed the compartment behind the torpedo body room, allowing 3,750 tons of water to enter the ship. Following this, Nelson's torpedo tubes may have been removed, although another source suggests the torpedo tubes were retained in both ships in 1945. Summary. Because of their unusual silhouette, HMS Nelson and her sister Rodney were sarcastically nicknamed Nelsol and Rodnall by the Royal Navy ratings who never served in these ships. Their maneuverability issues and single-funneled silhouettes reminded Navy men of oil tankers, and a series of fleet oilers that had been built during the First World War bearing names ending in "ol." There was a long-standing rumor that the ships could not fire a full broadside without risk of structural damage. This was disproved during the action against the German battleship Bismarck, where Rodney was able to fire upwards of 40 broadsides without major structural damage except to deck planking and upper deck fittings. Although damage to sickbay fittings, partition bulkheads, toilet bowls and plumbing in the forecastle was extensive. Virtually every light bulb in the forward section was shattered also. Despite the derisive criticism directed at this class of battleship by some of the media and some sailors upon the debut, naval historian Anthony Preston considered that they were soundly conceived ships reflecting all the hard-won experience of World War I, and that they proved to be very well protected and well-designed ships. Service. By the end of the war, Rodney had seen hard use without any significant refit or repair and was worn out, especially her machinery. Nelson had been refitted in the United States at the end of 1944 and was in sufficiently good condition to serve in the post-war fleet, including a short spell as flagship of the home fleet at the end of 1945. Rodney was scrapped in 1948 at Inverkeithing, not long after the Revenge-class battleships and Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, and Nelson in 1949 following its use as a target for bombing trials. According to Winston Churchill's memoirs, a major modernization was discussed to enable Nelson to serve for several years in the post-war fleet, but no other details have survived. In any case, Nelson was too slow for the modern fleet, which had no frontline role for battleships anymore. Ships